She had fired a lot of people. Not because she was ruthless, she wasn't. Not because she enjoyed it. Nobody who tells you they enjoy firing people is someone you should trust. She had fired people because running a company requires it sometimes, and she had learned early that the cleanest mercy in those moments is clarity. You say what you mean. You give them what they're owed. You don't drag it out. She had never, in 14 years of leading companies, had anyone say thank you. Not a performance, not sarcasm, not the hollow social reflex of a person in shock reaching for a familiar phrase. He had looked at her, steadily, clearly, without bitterness, and said, "Thank you. I mean that." Then he had picked up his bag, shaken her hand, and walked out of her office. She had stood at her window and watched him cross the parking lot. He had not looked back. That night, she had not slept. The second night, she had not slept. The third night, she had picked up her phone, found his number in the HR file she had no business keeping on her personal phone, and called him. He had answered. What he said had changed everything. The company was called Meridian Supply Partners. Regional industrial supply, the kind of business that exists in the infrastructure of every manufacturing economy and that most people have never heard of because most people have never needed to. Meridian sourced and distributed components to mid-sized manufacturers across Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. Bolts, fittings, seals, specialized fasteners, industrial adhesives, the thousand small things that held factories together. It was not a glamorous business. It was, in the right hands, a very good one. Rachel Okafor had been CEO for 3 years. She'd been brought in from a larger distribution company in Cleveland to stabilize Meridian after 2 bad years. A failed technology implementation, a key account loss that had cascaded through the sales pipeline, and a culture that had developed the specific dysfunction of an organization that had stopped being honest with itself. She had stabilized it. The first year had been brutal, the kind of restructuring that requires you to look clearly at every position, every process, every legacy arrangement that exists because it always has rather than because it should. She had made cuts. She had made changes. She had made enemies among the people who had been comfortable in the old arrangement, and allies among the people who had been waiting for someone to take the place seriously. By year 2, the company was improving. By year 3, it was good again. She had not enjoyed the first year. She had done it right. The firing of Thomas Cole had happened in month 8. He had been a procurement coordinator at Meridian for 4 years when Rachel arrived. 44 years old. Solidly built, in the way of someone who had done manual work earlier in his career and hadn't lost the physical competence of it. Dark hair with gray appearing at the edges. The kind of face that took a while to read, not closed, not guarded, just requiring more time than a quick glance. He had a son, 11 years old, named Eli. The only information Rachel had on this, from the HR file, was that Thomas had a dependent, and that his emergency contact was his mother rather than a spouse. She had drawn the obvious conclusion and had not investigated further, because it was not her business. Thomas's work record was unremarkable. That was the honest assessment. Not bad, there were no performance issues on file, no complaints, no disciplinary history. But in 4 years, the record showed a man who had done his job adequately and had not, by any visible metric, done more. The evaluations from his previous manager were full of the specific language of mediocrity, meets expectations. Reliable, completes assigned tasks. The role he held, procurement coordinator, was being eliminated, not because Thomas had failed at it, because the technology implementation that had been done badly before Rachel arrived was now being done correctly. And the correctly done version automated 3 of the 5 primary functions of the procurement coordinator role. The other 2 functions were absorbed into the expanded scope of the 2 remaining procurement managers. It was not personal, it was structural. She had explained this to Thomas in the meeting. He had listened the way he listened to everything, attentively without interrupting, with a quality of stillness that had, she noticed, not changed from the beginning of the conversation to the end of it. She had given him his severance package. 14 weeks. The maximum under company policy, references, outplacement support. She had asked if he had questions. He had asked, too, whether his health insurance ran through the end of the month, and whether the outplacement service included resume assistance. She had answered both. He had nodded. Then he had looked at her and said, "Thank you. I mean that." He had stood. He had picked up the small canvas bag he'd brought. He'd known, she realized, he'd known why he was being called in. And he'd brought the bag to carry what was in his desk rather than needing to come back for it. He had shaken her hand. He had walked out. She had watched him cross the parking lot. He had not looked back. She had a 4 p.m. call with the board chair after the meeting. She had told him the restructuring was proceeding on schedule. She had given him the numbers. He had expressed satisfaction with the progress and reminded her about the Q4 presentation timeline. She had hung up and sat at her desk. The thank you was sitting with her. Not loudly. She had a company to run. She had a 5 p.m. with the operations team. She had a dinner she was already 40 minutes late preparing for mentally. She didn't have time for the thank you to sit with her. It sat with her anyway. In the small, persistent way of a thing that doesn't fit the pattern. The way an odd result sits in the back of a researcher's mind even when the main work is elsewhere. The specific irritation of a data point that doesn't fit the model. She had fired people before. The range of responses was relatively predictable. Shock, in the cases where people hadn't seen it coming. Anger, sometimes, hot or cold depending on the person. Sadness, occasionally relief, when the fit had been bad for a long time and both parties had known it. Never gratitude. Not real gratitude. Not the kind that came with "I mean that." She had cooked dinner. She had answered emails. She had gone to bed at 11, which was earlier than usual, and was itself a response to the low-grade disturbance she was choosing not to examine. She had not slept. At 1 a.m. she was looking at the ceiling. At 2 a.m. she was still looking at the ceiling. At 3 a.m. she had picked up the book on her nightstand and read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining it. She had put the book down. She had looked at the ceiling some more. The question was not complicated. It was, in fact, a simple question. Why would a man who had just lost his job, who had a son to provide for, who had 4 years invested in a company that had just told him he wasn't needed anymore, why would that man be grateful? She didn't have an answer. That was why she wasn't sleeping. She ran the company. She had meetings. She made decisions. She sat in the operations review and identified 3 process inefficiencies that needed addressing. She had a productive call with the company's largest account in Michigan about expanding the relationship. She ate a sandwich at her desk and answered 47 emails and approved 2 expense reports, and had a difficult but necessary conversation with her VP of sales about a performance issue on his team. She did all of this at full capacity. And underneath all of it, in the quiet background frequency of her mind, the question ran, why did he say thank you? She found herself at odd moments trying to construct explanations. He was in shock. He hadn't processed it. The thank you was a reflex. The social automation of a man caught off guard who reached for the most neutral available phrase. She rejected this. His face had been too clear. His eyes too present. The "I mean" that too specific. He had wanted to leave with dignity, and the thank you was the most dignified exit available. Possible, but it didn't account for the quality of it. The lack of performance in it. If it had been dignity management, there would have been something managed in the delivery. There hadn't been. He genuinely didn't care about the job. She sat with this one longer. It fit some of the data. The mediocre evaluations, the absence of initiative, the record of a man doing the minimum. A man who didn't care about the job wouldn't mourn losing it. But the "I mean that" argued against it. If you didn't care, you didn't add the emphasis. The emphasis was specific. It pointed at something beyond the loss of the job. He had been grateful for something she'd given him. Not the severance. She'd seen his face when she laid out the severance. There was recognition there, acknowledgement, but not that quality of meaning. Something else. She went home. She made dinner. She answered emails. She went to bed. She did not sleep. At 11:43 p.m. on the 3rd night, Rachel Okafor got out of bed. She went to the kitchen. She made tea. She sat at the table and acknowledged, as she sometimes had to with herself, that she was going to think about this until she understood it, and the only way to understand it was to ask. She picked up her phone. She had kept the HR file open longer than she should have. She told herself this was procedural. She was still in the middle of the restructuring. The files were relevant. This was, she knew, not entirely true. She found his number. She looked at it for a moment. It was 11:43 p.m. She had a meeting at 7 a.m. She had approximately 7 hours in which she could theoretically sleep. She called. It rang 4 times. She was composing a voicemail in her head when he answered. His voice was alert, not groggy, alert, as though he'd been awake. Thomas Cole, he said. Thomas, she said. This is Rachel Okafor. I'm sorry to call this late. I wanted to ask you something. A pause. All right, he said. When you left my office 3 days ago, she said. You said thank you. I've been... She stopped. She started again. I've been trying to understand it. And I think the only way to understand it is to ask you directly. Why did you say it? Silence. Not a short silence. A long one. Long enough that she thought for a moment that she'd made a mistake. That this was too strange, too much, too far outside the professional boundary she'd been violating by keeping the file and making the call. Then he said, Are you driving? No, she said. I'm at my kitchen table. Good, he said, because it's a long answer. In part 2, what Thomas told her at 11:43 p.m. His full story, what the job had actually been, and the thing he said that made her set the phone down and stare at the wall for 60 seconds. He had been waiting for someone to ask. Not her specifically, not necessarily the CEO, just someone. The person the answer was meant for was whoever was paying enough attention to notice that the answer existed. Most people don't notice. Most people, when they fire a man, receive the expected response and file it and move on, because they have 7 other meetings and 4 years of restructuring and 47 emails. She had noticed. She had called. He had been awake, sitting at his kitchen table when the phone rang. He told her why. It took 45 minutes. When it was over, she sat at her own kitchen table and understood, for the first time in 3 days, why she hadn't been sleeping. She hadn't been sleeping because she had done something without knowing it, something that mattered more than she'd understood. She needed to know what she'd done. He'd spent 8 years in a different company before Meridian, a larger industrial supplier, national, publicly traded, the kind of company where the headquarters was in one city and the culture was set by people who had never visited the warehouses. He'd been a procurement specialist there, good at it, genuinely good, in the way he was good at most things that required careful attention to detail and the patience to track 1,000 small interdependencies. He had not been seen. That was the honest word for it. He had done his work well, year after year, and the work had been absorbed into the organization the way a river absorbs a tributary. Without acknowledgement, without particular recognition, and without any sense that the river would have been different without it. This had not destroyed him. He was not a man who needed external recognition to know his own worth. But over 8 years, something else had happened. Something quieter and harder to name. He had stopped believing that the work was for anything. Not that the work was bad. The supply chain functioned. Manufacturers got their components. The machinery of the industrial economy kept running. The work had real consequences. He knew this. But consequences and meaning are not the same thing. He had been executing tasks in service of a quarterly number that changed each quarter and was always insufficient for people in glass offices who did not know his name, in a company that measured the value of everything and the worth of no one. He had done this for 8 years. And then his wife had gotten sick. Her name was Diane. She and Thomas had met at a church picnic in Anderson, Indiana in 2006. She had been arguing with her brother about whether the potato salad needed more mustard. Thomas had been standing near enough to hear and had made the error of having an opinion. She had turned and looked at him. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who thinks the potato salad is fine," he said. "Wrong," she said. They had been together from that day. She was a nurse pediatric at Community Hospital in Anderson. She had been good at it in the specific way of people whose competence is inseparable from their care. Her patients were children, and she had a quality around sick children that Thomas had watched for 10 years and had never been able to fully describe. A kind of calm that was not distance. A steadiness that communicated, without words, "You are safe here, and I am not going anywhere." She had brought that quality home too. Eli had been born in 2012. For 2 years, 2012 and 2013, Thomas had looked at his life and understood it to be, by any honest measure, good, not grand. Not exceptional. Good. A woman he loved with everything in him. A son he was still figuring out how to be worthy of. Work that he did well. A house with a backyard where Diane grew tomatoes in the summer with more enthusiasm than success. The diagnosis came in 2014. Eli was 2 years old. He did not tell this part to Rachel in a continuous narrative. He told it in the way people tell it when they've told it before, not often, but enough to know where the edges were, to know which parts required the most care in the handling. Glioblastoma, the same diagnosis, the same enemy, the same specific horror of a tumor that does not negotiate and does not respond to hope. She died in 2016. Eli was 4, Thomas was 42 and alone, and had a 4-year-old, and had an 8-year job that had already been hollow before the loss and was now something he continued, because continuing was what you did. He had left that job in 2018, not because he was pushed out, because he had looked at it one morning and understood with sudden clarity that if he spent any more of his life doing work that meant nothing for people who saw no one, he would not survive it in any way that mattered. He had saved enough to leave cleanly. He had taken 3 months. He had spent those 3 months with Eli, just the two of them, nothing scheduled, moving through time without agenda. They had gone fishing twice. Badly, they had built a birdhouse that was structurally questionable. They had driven to Chicago on a Thursday for no reason and come back on Saturday. He had looked at his son, on those 3 months, with the specific attention of a man who has been given the gift of time and knows it is not permanent, and he had understood that what Eli needed from him was not income. Income was a mechanism. What Eli needed was a father who was present, who was whole, who had not allowed the work of surviving to consume the work of living. He had taken a job at Meridian in the fall of 2018, not because it was meaningful, because it was honest work, and it was near home, and it was compatible with being a present father. Here is what Thomas Cole had been doing for 4 years at Meridian, which the HR file described as reliable and meets expectations, and which those descriptors had entirely failed to capture. He had been learning. Not procurement. He already knew procurement. He had been learning the specific mechanics of how a small to mid-size industrial supply company actually worked. The margins, the customer relationships, the supplier dynamics, the operational leverage points that were visible from the procurement function if you were paying attention, and invisible if you weren't. He had been paying attention. He had also, though nobody had asked him to, and he had told nobody that he was doing it, been building something. In a folder on his personal laptop, not the company laptop, his personal one, he had been developing a business plan. Not Meridian's business plan. His own. A supply company. Smaller than Meridian. Focused on a segment that Meridian and its competitors were systematically underserving, small manufacturers, sub-50 employee operations, the kind that made specialized components for specific industries, and that the national and regional suppliers treated as too small to matter. They were not too small to matter. They were exactly the right size for a company that was built for them. He had spent 4 years at Meridian studying the gap. He had been ready to leave in the spring. The restructuring had been faster than he'd expected, which was why, when Rachel Okafor had sat across from him and told him that his role was being eliminated and here was his 14-week severance, he had felt, and this was the honest word for it, relief, not because she was unkind. Because she was kind. Because she had, without knowing it, handed him the starting gun. The 14-week severance was not, to Thomas Cole, 3.5 months of reduced income while he looked for another job. It was 3.5 months of funded runway. Runway to finish the business plan. Runway to have conversations he'd been putting off. Runway to do the work that the actual work had been preventing. He had known as he sat across from Rachel in her office that the 14 weeks were precisely what he needed. He had done the math. She hadn't seen him do it. It had happened in the 30 seconds while she was explaining the severance terms. But he'd done it. 14 weeks of full salary. His savings. His cost structure. His timeline. It was close. It was close enough. "Thank you," he had said. "I mean that." Because he had meant it. Because she had given him, wrapped in a pink slip, the exact thing he needed. Because the company that had been paying him to study it for 4 years had, in letting him go with generosity and without drama, funded the first chapter of what came next. He had not said any of this in her office. He had said it to her on the phone at 11:43 p.m. 3 days later, because she had been paying enough attention to call. He finished talking at 12:28 a.m. She sat at her kitchen table. She said nothing for 60 seconds. He waited. He was good at waiting. "You've been building a business," she said. "Yes, for 4 years. Yes, using our operation as the case study." "Not exactly," he said carefully. "Using the market gap I could see from inside your operation. That's a fine distinction. It's the accurate one," he said. "I didn't use Meridian's data. I used what was publicly observable about the market segment you and your competitors were all ignoring." She absorbed this. "And the 14 weeks, she said. "Is runway," he said. "To launch." Yes, she was quiet. "What kind of company?" she said. He told her. The segment. The approach. The specific operational model that he'd been developing, the supplier relationships he'd already begun cultivating quietly, the 3 small manufacturers he'd spoken to informally who had confirmed the demand. She listened the way she listened when she was doing real listening, not waiting for her turn but actually receiving. When he finished, she said, "You're going to need a line of credit." "I know." 14 weeks isn't enough runway for a supply company. "The payment cycles?" "I know the payment cycles," he said. "I've been in this industry for 12 years. "Then you know 14 weeks is tight." "It's tight," he said. "It's not impossible." She was quiet again. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, why didn't you tell anyone at Meridian what you were building?" A pause. "Because it wasn't relevant," he said. "I was doing my job. What I was doing on my own time was my business. It would have changed things." "I didn't want things changed," he said. "I wanted to watch the operation without being watched." She thought about that. "Like a scientist," she said. "Like a contractor," he said. "You look at the structure before you build." She thought about the 4 years of meets expectations, about the mediocre evaluations from a manager who had not known that the man filing procurement reports was also building a competitive intelligence dossier on an underserved market segment. She thought about the 14 weeks she'd given him. She thought about his thank you. She understood it completely now. It did not entirely make her feel better. "The 3 manufacturers you spoke to," she said, "any of them current Meridian accounts?" "No," he said. "I was careful about that." "I know you were," she said. A pause. "Go to sleep, Thomas," she said. "You too," he said. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table for another 20 minutes. Then she went to bed. For the first time in 3 days, she slept. In part 3, what she does with what she knows. The call she makes at 7 a.m. What Rachel Okafor does for a man who doesn't need her help and didn't ask for it. And the first time they meet as something other than employer and employee. She went to sleep at 1 a.m. and woke at 5:30. Not her alarm. Herself, she lay in bed for 40 minutes, looking at the ceiling, running a different calculation than the one that had kept her up for 3 nights. The previous calculation had been, why did he say thank you? The new calculation was, what do I do now? She had options. She could do nothing. She had fired him legally, ethically, with maximum severance and genuine goodwill. She had no obligation to do anything further. The phone call had satisfied her curiosity. She could close the file. She could do what her instinct was telling her to do, which was something considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting, and which had several obvious professional risks attached to it. She thought about the 3 manufacturers he'd mentioned. She thought about the market segment. She thought about 12 years of industry knowledge sitting in a man whose last evaluation had said reliable and meets expectations. She thought about the fact that she ran a company that had spent 14 years underserving the exact segment he was going to serve. She got out of bed at 5:30. She had a call to make before her 7 a.m. meeting. Her college roommate Priya was a partner at a venture lending firm in Indianapolis. Not a large firm, boutique, focused on regional small business. The kind of shop that did the deals that the banks considered too small and the VCs considered too boring. Rachel called her at 6:15 a.m. Priya answered because Priya was always up at 6 a.m., a habit she'd developed in business school and maintained with the dogmatic consistency of someone who had decided that 6 a.m. was not negotiable. "Rachel," she said, "it's 6 a.m. "I know," Rachel said. "I have someone I want you to talk to." A pause. "Before coffee?" "He's not going anywhere," Rachel said. "But I wanted to ask you before I told him you exist." "Tell me." She did. 10 minutes. The segment, the model, the 4 years of industry observation, the 3 manufacturer relationships, the runway problem. Priya was quiet for a moment. "Industrial supply to sub-50 employee manufacturers," she said. "Yes, that's a real gap." "I know. How do you know the business plan is solid?" "You said he's a procurement coordinator." "He was a procurement coordinator," Rachel said. "He was also spending 4 years building an intelligence map of a market segment. Those are not the same thing. You fired him, and now I fired him because the role was eliminated by automation," Rachel said. "That's true and irrelevant to what I'm telling you. You feel guilty." "I feel like I may have helped launch something interesting without knowing it," Rachel said. "I want to know if I did." A pause. "Does he know you're calling me?" "No, does he know you're going to call him?" "Not yet." "Rachel, will you talk to him?" A longer pause. "Have him send me a deck," Priya said. "If he has one." "If he's been building this for 4 years," Rachel said, "he has one." She hung up. She went to her 7 a.m. meeting. She called him at noon. He answered on the second ring this time. "I have a question," she said. "All right. The business plan. How far along is it?" A pause. "Why?" "Because. I called someone this morning," she said. "A venture lender I know. She focuses on regional small business. I told her about your model." Silence. "You told her about my model," he said. "Yes, without asking me." "Yes," a pause. "I'm asking now." The silence that followed was different from the one on the previous call. This one had texture. He was thinking and thinking carefully, and she could feel the quality of it through the phone. "Why?" he said. "Because you have a runway problem, and I have a contact who might be able to solve it," she said. "And because?" She stopped. "Because?" he said. "Because I gave you 14 weeks of severance, and the decent thing would be to also give you a chance to make them count." She said. "I can make them count without your help," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm offering it anyway." Another pause. "She'll want a deck," Rachel said. "I have a deck," he said. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because you've been building this for 4 years," she said. "And you're not the kind of person who builds something for 4 years without a deck." The pause this time was shorter. "I need to think about it," he said. "Take today," she said. "I told her I'd let her know by tomorrow morning." He said he'd call her back. He called back at 4 p.m. "Send me her contact information," he said. She did. Thomas had not told Illy about the job. Not because he was hiding it. Illy was 11, and 11-year-olds have a sufficient relationship with financial anxiety without adding fuel to it, but because there was nothing to tell yet that required telling. The job was gone. Something else was coming. The in-between was Thomas's to manage. He had told Eli that he was taking some time to work on a new project. Eli had accepted this with the practical intelligence of a boy who had learned, at 4 years old, that the things you were told were not always the whole story, and that the thing to do with the part you weren't told was wait. He was, by 11, an exceptionally patient child. He had his mother's quality of stillness, Diane's specific brand of calm, not passivity, but the product of having decided, at a deep level, that most things resolved themselves if you didn't panic them. He was also, Thomas had been noticing for about 2 years, building towards something. The way he approached problems, anything from a broken bike chain to a difficult homework assignment to a disagreement with a friend, had a quality of deliberateness that went beyond his years. He looked at things. He thought about them before he acted. He was going to be formidable. Thomas thought about this sometimes with a specific mixture of pride and something that took him a while to identify as grief. The grief was for Diane, for what she was missing, for the boy she didn't get to know, for the fact that the person who would have understood most clearly what Eli was becoming was the one person who wasn't there to see it. He managed this grief the way he managed most things, by keeping his hands occupied and his eyes forward. On the night after he decided to send his deck to Priya, he made dinner and sat across from Eli at the kitchen table and watched his son do homework with the focused economy of a child who has learned to finish things rather than leaving them. "Dad," Eli said, without looking up. "Yes. Are you starting a company?" Thomas was quiet. "What makes you ask that?" "You've been on the phone a lot," Eli said, "and you have that look." "What look?" Eli looked up. "The one you get when you're figuring something out," he said, "like when you were fixing the furnace and you had to find the part that wasn't made anymore. But bigger." Thomas looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "I'm starting a company." Eli nodded. "Okay," he said. He went back to his homework. Thomas watched him for a moment. "Are you worried?" Thomas asked. Eli considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No," he said. "You always figure it out." He went back to his math. Thomas sat with that for a while. Priya called Rachel 10 days after the introduction. Rachel was in her car, leaving the office, when the call came. "Your procurement guy," Priya said. "He's not my procurement guy. The one you sent me." "Yes, the deck is good," Priya said. "How good?" "Better than most of what we see," Priya said. "The market analysis is detailed in a way that usually only comes from consultants who have done deep sector research. He did it himself." 4 years of fieldwork, Rachel said. "It shows. The model is sound. The margins are realistic, not optimistic, which is what we usually get. The supplier relationships he's identified are legitimate. What's your read on him personally?" A pause. "Unusual," Priya said. "In what way?" "He asks different questions than most founders," she said. "Most founders want to know about the money first, and the terms second, and everything else eventually. He asked about our portfolio companies first. Wanted to understand what we'd seen work and what we'd seen fail. He was doing due diligence on you," Rachel said. "Yes, it was," a pause. "Refreshing. Are you going to fund him?" "We're going to the next conversation," Priya said. "Which is more than I can say for most of what crosses my desk." Rachel sat in her car in the parking lot. "Good," she said. "You went to bat pretty hard for someone you fired," Priya said. "I gave him 14 weeks of severance," Rachel said. "And then I lost 3 nights of sleep because he thanked me for it." "He thanked you for firing him?" "He meant it," Rachel said. A pause. "I like him more now," Priya said. "Most people do," Rachel said, "once they pay attention." Rachel did something else after the call with Thomas. She went back to Meridian. Not to the building, she was there every day. She went back to the question his plan had surfaced. He had identified a market segment that Meridian and its competitors were all ignoring. He had spent 4 years watching it from inside her company. He had built a business model around it. He had been right about the gap. She had been running a company for 3 years, and she had not seen the gap. That was worth examining. She pulled the customer data. She looked at the inquiries they received from sub-50 employee manufacturers. She looked at how those inquiries were handled, what the conversion rate was, what happened when the deal didn't close. She found what Thomas had found. Not exactly. She didn't have 4 years of dedicated study. She had 2 days of focused analysis. But the shape was there. The small manufacturers who reached out and got routed to a standard sales process designed for clients 10 times their size. The ones who got quoted minimum order quantities they couldn't meet. The ones who were told the lead times didn't work for them. The ones who left without a solution. She looked at the volume. It was not a trivial number. She called her VP of sales into her office. "Tell me about our small manufacturer segment," she said. He blinked. "We don't have a small manufacturer segment," he said. "Exactly," she said. "Tell me why not." The conversation took 2 hours. At the end of it, she had a project, a small manufacturer program, built for the segment Thomas had identified, with a different model than the standard one. She built it over the following 6 weeks. She thought about Thomas Cole throughout. Not sentimentally. Practically, she was building on an insight she had received from a man who had been watching from inside her company. The honest thing to do with that was acknowledge it. Not in public, not in a press release, but in herself. She acknowledged it. She kept building. In part 4, Thomas's full story. The year Diane was sick. What it did to him. What it made him. And the thing he built in those years that had nothing to do with the business plan. There is a version of this story where the loss breaks him, where the 2 years of his wife's illness and the years of raising a son alone in the aftermath hollow him out, make him smaller, teach him that the world is the kind of place where the most important things are taken and the least important things remain. That is not this story. This is the story of what grief made of Thomas Cole. Not despite the loss. Because of it. Because grief, when it doesn't break you, has a way of clarifying everything. Burning off what isn't essential. Leaving you with a cleaner understanding of what you are and what you're for, and what you will not spend another day pretending is enough. He had lost Diane. He had found in the years after something that the years before had never quite given him, a reason. Diane had been diagnosed in August of 2014. She had been having headaches, the specific kind, behind the left eye, the kind that didn't move and didn't respond to the ordinary remedies. She had put off the doctor the way nurses sometimes do, with the occupational knowledge of what the appointment might produce. The appointment had produced what she'd feared. The tumor was operable. They had tried. The surgery had been successful in the technical sense, the bulk of it removed, the margins as clean as the margin could be. The radiation had followed. The chemotherapy. The full protocol. 2 years of it. Thomas had worked through both years. Not because the money was critically tight. They had savings. They had Diane's disability. They had the specific infrastructure of a couple who had planned carefully. He worked because Diane had asked him to, for the same reason he would later tell Eli he was starting a company, and Eli would say, "You always figure it out." She had known who he was. She had known that work was how he held his shape. He had taken Eli to daycare at 7 a.m. He had worked until 4. He had picked up Eli. He had gone home to Diane, who was often tired from treatment and always, when she had the energy for it, more interested in hearing about Eli's day than in talking about her own. He had made dinner every night. He had learned, in those 2 years, to make 22 dinners that Diane could eat on the hardest days, when the nausea was high and the appetite was low, and what she could manage was something specific and uncomplicated. He still made all 22 of them. Eli ate them rotating, unsuspectingly, and they were Thomas's form of memorial. The nights had been hard. He had sat in the kitchen, after Diane and Eli were in bed, with the lights low, and he had done what people do when they are in the waiting room of a loss they cannot stop. He had thought about what mattered. He had thought about it very carefully. He had reached conclusions that would take him years to fully act on. Eli was 4 when Diane died. This is the age that is hardest to predict. Old enough to know something irrevocable has happened. Not old enough to have the language for it. The grief of a 4-year-old is stored in the body rather than processed in the mind. It comes out in behavior, in sleep, in the way they hold themselves, in the questions they ask 6 months after the event, when the mind is finally built enough architecture to form the question. Eli had asked at 4.5 whether his mother was coming back. Thomas had told him the true thing, no. And then he had told him the other true thing, which was that she had loved him more than anything in the world, and that she would have stayed if she could, and that the fact that she couldn't didn't change the first thing. Eli had sat with this for a long time, Then he had said, "Does she still love me?" Thomas had looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "That doesn't stop." Eli had nodded. He had accepted this with the specific solemnity of a child who has decided to trust the answer even though he can't verify it, which is, Thomas would think later, not a bad model for faith. He had gone about his day. Thomas had sat in the kitchen after Eli went to bed and had stayed there for a long time. The thing about grief he had come to understand was that it didn't come for you all at once. It came in installments. And the installments were not predictable. They arrived with the smell of something she used to cook, or in the specific quality of light on Tuesday afternoon, or in the way Eli held his fork, which was the way Diane had held hers. He had learned to receive the installments, to not run from them and to not be consumed by them, to hold them and keep moving. He had gone back to the larger company after Diane died. It had been 6 weeks of leave, the standard, which had been applied with mechanical precision by an HR department that had never met Diane and had no particular interest in Thomas beyond his continued function as a unit of productivity. He had returned to work. For 2 years after her death, he had functioned. He had done his job. He had raised Eli. He had maintained the house, paid the bills, attended the parent-teacher conferences and the school plays and the pediatric checkups. He had done all the things a father does, and he had done them without the resource of another adult who could carry half the weight on the days when half the weight was all he had. He had, over those 2 years, made a series of small internal decisions that he hadn't recognized as a series until they were already made. The decision to stop caring about advancement at the company. The decision to stop pretending that the quarterly numbers had anything to do with why he was there every morning. The decision that the years he was spending were finite and that spending them in service of a transaction, his labor for their revenue, was a choice, and choices could be changed. He had left in 2018. The 3 months with Eli, the fishing, the birdhouse, the Chicago trip, had not been a vacation. They had been a reset. A decision, made in practice rather than in theory, about what the remaining years were for. He had chosen Meridian specifically, not randomly, not because it was convenient, though it was convenient, because he had done research, the same kind of research he would spend 4 years doing from the inside, and had identified it as the right vantage point. He needed a company in the industrial supply sector, small enough that he could see the whole operation, old enough that it had legacy patterns worth studying, regional enough that the market segment he was interested in was visible. Meridian fit all three. He had applied for the procurement coordinator role knowing it was below his skill level and not caring. His former manager, the one who had written reliable and meets expectations in the evaluations, had been a man of average intelligence who had assessed Thomas at face value and concluded that a man doing adequate work at a below-his-level job was a man of adequate ability. He had not thought to ask why a man of Thomas's experience and background was in this role. People rarely ask that question. Thomas had been grateful for it. He had spent 4 years watching, mapping, learning. He had watched the sales team lose small manufacturer accounts and not understand why. He had watched the procurement process ignore the supplier relationships that would have served that segment. He had watched a company execute its existing model with increasing efficiency and never question whether the model was the right one. He had built his alternative in the margins. He had filed his notes. He had built his spreadsheets. He had talked to 3 small manufacturers, carefully, in the last 6 months, confirming the demand, testing the model. He had been 3 months from leaving when Rachel's restructuring had arrived first. Thomas had made a practice, since Ely was 5, of telling him one thing about his mother every week. Not a scheduled thing, not a formal ritual, just whenever the moment was right, he would tell Eli something. A story, a detail, a quality. The way she laughed, the way she'd argued about potato salad, the 22 dinners, the specific way she'd held her patient's hands in the pediatric ward, not in the medical way, the human way, the way that communicated you are safe here. He had told Eli about the day they'd met, about the tape measure in the lobby, about the fact that she'd been right about the mustard in the potato salad, which he had finally admitted, privately, to himself in 2019. He had told Eli about the conversation they'd had, near the end, about what she wanted for him. She had wanted him to be okay. She had wanted him to grow up in a world where people showed up for each other, where the work of living was shared, where being small didn't mean being ignored. She had worried about the world's tendency to lose small things. She had been a pediatric nurse. She had known, professionally, what it meant when systems didn't protect the smallest and most vulnerable. He had told Eli this. Eli had been 9 when Thomas told him. He had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "Is that why you're going to start a company? To not lose the small things?" Thomas had looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "Something like that." Eli had nodded. He had gone back to whatever he'd been doing. Thomas had sat with the fact that his 9-year-old had just articulated, in 9 words, the thing Thomas had been trying to articulate for 2 years. To not lose the small things. The company Thomas was building had a name. He had chosen it carefully, the way he chose most things. Coal Supply Partners. The name was deliberate in 2 directions. Coal because it was his, and the company was his, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. Partners because the model was partnership. Not vendor and client, not supplier and account, but genuine partnership. The kind that invested in understanding what a small manufacturer actually needed, rather than what the standard catalog offered. The operational model was different from Meridian's in 3 ways. The first was account size. Coal Supply Partners would not take accounts above a certain revenue threshold. This was counterintuitive. Most supply companies scaled up, chased the big accounts, let the small ones churn. Thomas was going in the opposite direction. The small accounts were his entire business. The second was service model. No minimum order quantities. No standard lead times. Customized sourcing for specialized components that the national suppliers didn't stock. This required different supplier relationships. Smaller, more flexible, more willing to work on custom terms. He had spent 2 years building those relationships quietly. The third was terms. He was building a pricing model that was transparent, his margins visible to the customer, the logic of the pricing explained. This was unusual enough in the industry that the first small manufacturer he'd told about it had asked him to repeat it. "You're going to show us your margins?" the manufacturer had said. "Yes," Thomas said. "Why?" "Because you're a small company," he said. "You need to know where every dollar is going. And because if you trust me, we'll work together longer than if you're always wondering whether I'm giving you a fair deal." The manufacturer had looked at him. "That's either the smartest thing I've ever heard," she said, "or the most naive." "Both, probably," Thomas said. Let's see. In part 5, what happens between Thomas and Rachel as the company grows. The lunch she didn't plan and the things she says. And Eli, at 11, meeting Rachel Okafor for the first time and saying the one thing nobody expected. She had not planned to have lunch with him. She had planned to call his reference. Priya had asked for a character reference from someone outside the professional context. Someone who knew Thomas as a person rather than an employee. And Thomas had given Rachel's name, which had required a brief phone call. The brief phone call had become a conversation. The conversation had somehow produced a lunch. She wasn't sure how. She suspected it was because Thomas Cole was the kind of person who made conversations longer without trying. Not because he was particularly talkative, but because the things he said were the kind of things that required responses. And the responses required further responses. And before you knew it, you were 45 minutes in, and neither of you had started eating. She had noticed this on the phone at 11:43 p.m. She was noticing it again across a table at a diner in Anderson, Indiana, on a Tuesday in November. Priya had asked the question directly, as she always did, "Tell me who he is." Not professionally. Who he is. Rachel had thought about how to answer. "He's the kind of person," she said slowly, "who watches very carefully and acts very deliberately. He doesn't move until he understands what he's moving through. And when he moves, he doesn't look back," she said. A pause. "Personal integrity?" Priya asked. "Absolute," Rachel said. "He was inside my company for 4 years. He built a competitive plan using market observations, not proprietary data, and I confirmed this, but it would have been easy to cross the line and he didn't. He was scrupulous about it. How do you know? Because I went looking, she said. After I understood what he'd been doing, I had our IT team do a quiet audit of the system access on his accounts. He never once pulled data he wasn't authorized to access. He did everything from what was publicly observable. That's unusual. It's who he is, Rachel said. Last question, Priya said. Do you regret firing him? Rachel was quiet for a moment. I regret that the role was eliminated, she said. I don't regret that it was. The automation was right. The decision was right. A pause. What I feel about the specific person is, she stopped. What? Priya said. I think I wasted 4 years of someone's best thinking, Rachel said. Not because I was negligent, because I wasn't paying attention to the right things. That's a generous thing to say about someone you let go. It's the true thing, Rachel said. Priya had paused. You should have lunch with him, she said. That's not. Rachel, you've been his de facto advocate for 6 weeks. Have lunch with him. She had called Thomas. He had suggested the diner in Anderson, which was 12 miles from her office, and had been, he mentioned without elaboration, a place he and Diane had gone on their first date. She had not asked about the significance. She had written down the address. It was a real diner. Not the kind that performs being a diner, the artificially retro aesthetic, the ironic menu. A real one, with vinyl booth seats and a pie counter and coffee that arrived without asking. She was 5 minutes early. He was already there. He was in the same flannel shirt and different pants from the one time she'd seen him, the firing, which felt like a different era now, and he was reading something on his phone, not in the distracted way, but in the focused way, in the way of someone who does one thing at a time. He looked up when she came in. He stood, which she hadn't expected. They shook hands. They sat. The coffee arrived. She said, Priya called me. I know, he said. She told me she was going to. You gave her my name as a reference, she said. You're the most recent person to have observed my professional behavior, he said. You were the accurate choice. You could have listed your previous manager. He thought I was reliable, Thomas said. That wasn't useful to Priya. She looked at him. What did you think he'd say about you? She said. He'd have said I was adequate, Thomas said, which is true and insufficient. Why didn't you show him what you were capable of? Because I wasn't working for him, Thomas said. She held that. You were working for the plan, she said. I was working for Eli, he said. The plan was the vehicle. She was quiet. Tell me about him, she said. He talked about Eli for 20 minutes. Not the way parents sometimes talk about their children, the listing of achievements, the anecdote as credential. He talked about Eli the way you talk about someone you are genuinely interested in. Who he was, what he noticed, what he cared about. The patience, the specificity, the particular quality of his thinking, the way he approached problems the same way Thomas approached structures. Looking first, understanding the logic, then acting. He told me, Thomas said. When he was 9, I'd told him about Diane's worries, about the small things being lost, he said. Is that why you're going to start a company? To not lose the small things? Rachel looked at him. 9 years old, she said. He'd been listening, Thomas said. He always listens. He just waits until he has something worth saying. He sounds like you. Thomas was quiet for a moment. He's more than me, he said. He has his mother in him, her way of being with people. He notices things about people that I have to work to see. A pause. She was a pediatric nurse. She had this quality with sick kids, just absolute presence, no performance, just, I'm here and you're safe. He has it. I don't know where it goes in him yet, but it's there. She looked at her coffee. Diane, she said. Yes, you talk about her in present tense sometimes, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She's present, he said simply. The 22 dinners, the things I tell Eli every week, the business, the idea about not losing small things. She's in all of it. A pause. I don't know what to call that except present. I think that's exactly what to call it, Rachel said. She told him about the small manufacturer program. She hadn't been sure until she was in the diner with him that she was going to. There was a professional awkwardness to it. I fired you and then used your insight to build something at the company that fired you. that she had been circling around for 6 weeks. She told him directly, because direct was the only way she knew how to do anything that mattered. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How far along is it?" he said. "We soft-launched 6 weeks ago," she said. 3 accounts in the first month. 12 now. He looked at his coffee. "What minimum order threshold did you use?" She told him. He nodded slowly. "That's close," he said. "I'd have set it about 20% lower." "Why?" "Because the manufacturers who need this most are the ones who can't meet even a low threshold without planning for it," he said. "The threshold still creates a barrier. The goal is no barrier." She considered this. "That tightens your margins significantly," she said. "My margins are built for that," he said. "Yours probably aren't." "No," she said. He looked at her. "You built a real thing," he said. "Not flattery." "Assessment. I built it on your insight," she said. "You built it on a gap that was visible to anyone who looked," he said. "I looked. You looked later. The market doesn't care who looked first. I care," she said. He was quiet. "Why?" he said. "Because I want to do the honest thing with it," she said. "I don't know exactly what the honest thing is, but I know it involves telling you." He looked at her for a long time. "You're a strange CEO," he said. "I've been told," she said. "I mean it as a compliment." "I know," she said. At the end of lunch, the coffee had been refilled twice, the pie had been ordered and consumed, the diner had gone from lunchtime full to mid-afternoon quiet around them. She asked the question she'd been building to. She had not realized she was building to it until she was already asking it. "Coal supply partners," she said. "What does success look like in 3 years?" He thought about it. 40 accounts, he said. All sub-50 manufacturers. All in a 3-state region. All on transparent pricing. All with supplier relationships customized to their specific component needs. Revenue? He gave her a number. And in 10 years? He was quiet for a moment. "I want Eli to have the option," he said. "Of taking over the company? Of building on it," he said. "If he wants to. He's 11. He might want to do something completely different. That's fine, but I want there to be something worth building on if he decides he wants to." She looked at him. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, I'm going to ask you something that you can say no to," she said. "And I want you to say no if the answer is no. I'm not building to anything with this." He waited. "I've been thinking about the small manufacturer program at Meridian," she said. "About the gap you identified. About what it would look like to do it properly, not as a feature of a larger company, but as its own thing." "You're describing my company," he said. "I'm describing the category," she said. "And I'm wondering whether there's a version of this where Meridian is a resource for you rather than a competitor. Supplier relationships. Regional account access. Infrastructure?" He was very still. "You're proposing a partnership," he said. "I'm proposing a conversation about whether one makes sense," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at the pie counter. He looked at the table. He looked at her. "I need to think about it," he said. "Take as long as you need," she said. "I'll call you," he said. She believed him. In part 6, what Eli says when Thomas tells him about the conversation. The decision Thomas makes, the morning 6 months later when everything changes. And what Rachel understands, standing in a building that is no longer the one she thought she was running. He called her back in 4 days. Not because he needed 4 days to decide. He'd known by the end of lunch, and the way he knew most things, with a certainty that arrived from the whole of his understanding rather than from deliberation. He'd needed 4 days to talk to Eli. Not to get permission. Eli was 11, and it was Thomas's company, and the decision was Thomas's to make. He'd needed 4 days because Eli was the person he thought with, in the way that some people think out loud and need another mind in the room to hear it back at them. Eli had listened to the whole thing. He had asked 2 questions. The first one was obvious. The second one Thomas hadn't seen coming. Thomas had told Eli about Rachel on a Sunday evening. He'd made the pasta, the Sunday pasta, the one that went back to Thomas's Italian grandmother through 15 iterations of family use. And they'd eaten, and cleared the table, and Eli had looked at him with the patient attention of someone who had noticed, over 4 days, that his father was thinking about something, Tell me, Eli said. So Thomas had told him. The firing, the phone call, the reference call, the lunch, the small manufacturer program at Meridian, the conversation about partnership. Eli had listened without interrupting. When Thomas finished, Eli said, "Do you trust her?" Thomas thought about it. "Yes," he said. "Why?" "Because she lost 3 nights of sleep over a thank you," he said. "And then she called me at 11:43 p.m. to find out why." A pause. That's someone who pays attention to things that don't add up. That's someone with a conscience that works. Eli considered this. "And the partnership," he said. "What does it mean for the company?" "It could mean better supplier access," Thomas said. "Regional infrastructure, speed to market." He paused. "It also means a relationship with a larger company that has its own interests." "Do her interests conflict with yours?" "Not obviously," Thomas said. "I've been thinking about whether they could. And the segment I'm serving is too small for her to want it back," he said. "Her company needs scale to justify the attention. The accounts I'm taking are the ones she can't serve well. It's not competition. It's complimentary," Eli said. Thomas looked at his son. "Yes," he said. "Exactly that." Eli nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked the second question. "Dad," he said, "do you like her?" Thomas looked at his son. Eli looked back at him with Diane's quality of attention, the same complete, undeflectable presence. Not asking about the business, asking about the person. Thomas was quiet for a long time. "I think so," he said carefully. "Does that feel wrong?" Eli asked. He had not expected the question to be that direct or that perceptive. "It's complicated," he said. "Because of Mom?" Eli said. "Because of many things," Thomas said. Eli thought about this. "Mom would have liked her," he said. "From what you said. She calls people at midnight because she can't stop thinking about something that doesn't add up. Mom was like that." Thomas was quiet. "She was," he said. "So, it's not wrong," Eli said. "It's just new." He picked up his fork. New things are usually okay. He went back to his pasta. Thomas sat with that for a long time. He called Rachel on Thursday morning. "Yes," he said, when she answered. A pause. "To the conversation about partnership?" she said. "To the conversation," he said. "What it becomes after that I can't tell you yet. That's all I asked for." She said. They met at Meridian the following Tuesday. Thomas, Rachel, and Meridian's VP of Operations, who had been briefed at a high level and was bringing the specific wariness of someone who understood that this was unusual and hadn't decided yet whether unusual was good. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Thomas asked the same kind of questions he'd asked Priya. Not about the money, not about the terms. About the relationship, how Meridian made decisions, how conflicts were resolved, what the company did when a partner's interests and its own diverged. The VP of Operations had answered all of them. Carefully, because the questions were careful. At the end he had said to Rachel, in the way of someone who had formed an opinion and decided not to keep it to himself, he's going to be the most demanding partner we've ever had. "I know," Rachel said. "I mean that as, I know," she said. "So do I." The partnership framework was agreed in principle by the end of February. The formal agreement took another 6 weeks of legal review. Thomas launched Coal Supply Partners formally in March. With Meridian's supplier access and regional infrastructure, and his own operational model and account base, the launch timeline moved from 12 months to 4. He had 42 accounts by June. The small manufacturer program at Meridian grew, not because Rachel had forced it, because Thomas's operational model, which she had studied carefully in the partnership process, had shown her things about her own company's approach that she hadn't seen before. The transparent pricing, in particular. She had not implemented it at Meridian. The margin structure of a larger company couldn't support the same model. But the philosophy behind it had changed how she thought about customer relationships. The principle, they should know where every dollar is going, because if they trust you, you work together longer, was applicable at any scale. She had started applying it. Slowly, in the way of large organizations changing, but visibly. Her VP of Sales had pushed back, Transparent pricing weakens our negotiating position, he said. It eliminates the negotiation, she said. Which is the point. He had pushed back more. She had held. 6 months later, the small manufacturer program's account retention rate was 14 points higher than the company's overall average. The VP of sales had stopped pushing back. It happened at a Coal Supply Partners open house, an informal event Thomas had organized for his accounts and partners in the offices he'd taken in Anderson in April. Small, efficient, in a building he'd chosen with the same care he brought to everything. Rachel had come as a partner. Eli had come because it was a Saturday, and he went where his father went on Saturdays. He was in the corner of the room when Rachel came in, eating a piece of cheese from the food table and reading something on his phone. Not in the distracted way, in the focused way. Thomas had introduced them. Eli had looked up. He had looked at Rachel with the unfiltered assessment of an 11-year-old who has been told something significant about a person and is checking the information against the source. "You're the one who called at midnight," he said. Rachel looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has decided not to intervene. 11:43, she said. "Yes," Eli considered her. "Dad says you couldn't sleep because the thank you didn't fit," he said. "That's right," she said. "He thanks people when they do something that matters to him," Eli said, "even when it doesn't seem like the thing matters. It confuses people." She looked at the boy. "Does it confuse you?" "No," Eli said. "I know which things matter to him." "What mattered about my firing him?" Eli looked at her. "The 14 weeks," he said. "And the way you told him. He said you were clear. He said you didn't dress it up." He paused. "He said you treated him like someone who could handle the truth. Not many people do that." She was quiet. "He told you all this?" she said. "He tells me things," Eli said simply. "He always has." He looked at his phone, then back at her. "You built something at your company using his idea." "Yes," she said. "Did you tell him thank you?" She looked at him. "Not in those words," she said. Eli nodded. "You should," he said. "He'd appreciate it." He went back to his cheese and his phone. Rachel looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at the ceiling. She pressed her lips together. She did not laugh, which took some effort. 6 months after the partnership launched, Rachel drove to Anderson for a Coal Supply Partners operational review. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Cold. The specific flat gray of Indiana in November. The kind of morning that asks nothing of the light and gets nothing back. She arrived 20 minutes early and parked on the street. She sat in the car, not because she was nervous, because she had developed, in the months of knowing Thomas Cole and understanding what he was building, a habit she hadn't had before, stopping before she went into something to think about what she was walking into. Not the business agenda, the thing itself. She thought about the firing, almost a year ago. The man across the desk who had received the end of his employment with clarity and was something she now understood completely. He had been grateful, not for the loss, for the 4 years that had given him the map, for the 14 weeks that had given him the runway, for the manner, the specific manner of a CEO who had been clear and fair and had not made it about herself. He had been grateful for being treated like someone who could handle the truth. She had not understood, when she made that choice, that it was a choice. She had simply done it the way she did everything. Directly, cleanly, with as much generosity as the situation allowed. She had not known she was giving him something. She sat in the car on the gray November morning and understood, fully and without remainder, what the thank you had been about. It had not been about the severance. It had not been about the runway. It had been about the 11-year-old boy at the food table who had said, "He told me you treated him like someone who could handle the truth." Not many people do that. She had treated him like a whole person. In the moment when most people become a transaction, a name on a termination form, a line item in a restructuring report, she had looked at him and seen him. Not because she was trying to. Because she always had. She hadn't known. She knew now. She got out of the car. She went in. On a Tuesday morning in December, Thomas Cole and Rachel Okafor sat across from each other in the Coal Supply Partners office and reviewed the 6-month partnership numbers. The numbers were good, not extraordinary, A 6-month-old company with 42 accounts was not yet extraordinary, but solid, growing in the right direction, with the specific quality of a business that was being built rather than extracted. When the review was done, Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. She looked at it. She thought about Eli. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, thank you," she said. "For the last year, for the business plan you were building while I was running a company that couldn't see you, for the phone call, for the patience with Priya, for the lunch." She paused. "For letting me build something on your insight, and for not making that complicated." He looked at her. "And for introducing me to your son," she said, "who is going to be extraordinary." He was quiet for a moment. "He already is," he said. "I know," she said. "He gets it from both of them." He looked at his coffee. "Diane would have had a lot to say about all of this," he said. "I think she'd have approved," Rachel said. "Of which part?" "The part where you didn't waste the 14 weeks, she said. "The part where you built the right thing. The part where your son already knows which things matter." She paused. "All of it." He was quiet. "She'd have been impressed by you," he said. "I'd have liked to have earned that," Rachel said. "You did," he said, "long before you met her son." They sat with their coffee in the December morning. Outside, Anderson went about its business. The flat gray sky, the ordinary Tuesday of a working town in the Midwest. Inside, a man who had said thank you to the person who had fired him, and a woman who hadn't slept for 3 days trying to understand why, sat across from each other in the company he'd built on 14 weeks she'd given him. Both of them knew what the thank you had been about now. Both of them understood that it had been, from the beginning, exactly what it looked like. Not politeness, not shock, not performance. Gratitude, the specific gratitude of a man who had been seen, clearly and without discount, at the exact moment when most people stop looking. He had said thank you. She had not slept for 3 days. And in not sleeping, in calling, in asking the question, in listening to the long answer, she had become, without trying to, exactly the kind of person whose thank you would also mean something when the time came. Which it did. Which it always does. For people who pay attention. She fired him on a Thursday. She gave him 14 weeks and a handshake in the specific dignity of a CEO who did the hard thing clearly and without making it about herself. He said thank you. He meant it. She didn't sleep for 3 days. Not because she felt guilty. She'd done everything right. Because the thank you didn't fit the pattern. Because a man who had just lost his job had looked at her with clarity and gratitude and she didn't know why, and the not knowing sat in her like a question that deserved an answer. She called at 11:43 p.m. He answered. He told her. And in the telling, in the 45 minutes of a long answer that explained 4 years of quiet watching, in 14 weeks of funded runway, and the son who said his father thanked people when something mattered, she understood something about the work she'd been doing without knowing she was doing it. You can treat people like whole people without knowing you're doing it. You can give someone their dignity in a hard moment without calling it dignity. You can be clear and fair and generous in the daily work of running a company, and it can mean more to a man with a plan and a son and a dead wife's 22 dinners than any performance of kindness ever could. She had not known she was giving him something. She had given him something anyway. He had said thank you. He had meant it. She understood now. She ran her company differently for it. Not perfectly, not overnight, but differently, with the specific awareness of someone who knows that the people across the desk are always more than the file in front of her, and that how you do the hard things is the whole of what you are. He had taught her that, with 2 words and 3 nights of her sleep and a long answer at midnight. Thank you. I mean that. The end.